Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Now today I'm going to be going over every Premier League club in their worst season of the past decade going back to 2010-2011 season. Now this is not just including Premier League seasons, this includes every season for every club who's been below the Premier League as well. So there's a few really obvious ones in here, but there also is a few difficult-ish ones in here to choose from. So I'll crack on. Arsenal 2017-2018. This was Arsene Wenger's last season at the club. And it was a pretty forgettable one as well. Arsenal finished sixth in the Premier League, never really looked like they were in the top four race. The season pretty much felt like a write-off. Arsene Wenger announced his departure around April time, mid-April, and that kind of really said to Arsenal weren't having a great season. This season really felt like an indication that Wenger had gone on too long at Arsenal. And yeah, they just kind of fell off. They were playing Europa League football as well. No trophies in this season either. It was a pretty unconvincing season for Arsenal, to be honest, and definitely a forgettable one. Aston Villa 2015-2016, very obvious choice here. Aston Villa put up a pretty pathetic 2015-16 campaign where they only won 3 Premier League games all season, which was pretty appalling, to be honest with you. And they went down. They have returned to the Premier League since here, so fair play to them. But this season was awful for Villa, and yeah, they definitely would like to forget about this one. I'm sure most Villa fans already have. AFC Bournemouth 2011-2012, they finished 11th in League One. Now AFC Bournemouth had a fantastic rise in the past decade and a half or so, so it's difficult to really name a Bournemouth season, but in 2011-12 season they finished 11th in League One. It was a mid-table bog standard season, and considering what they've achieved since with promotions and then solid Premier League finishes, surviving relegation, it's a pretty easy choice to say the mid-table finish in League One was quite a forgettable season for them overall, but it's only been on the way up ever since to Bournemouth, so fair play to them. Brighton and Hove Albion at 2014-2015, 20th in the Championship now. What a story Brighton and Hove Albion really have had. 20th in the Championship just 5 seasons ago, roughly. And, that's just about surviving relegation. So that just proves how important surviving that relegation was. The fact that just a couple of years later they kicked on and came up to the Premier League. It's just mad to think, really, they nearly got relegated. Well, this was a poor season for Brighton, really, and, they were always there and thereabouts. But Brighton really turned it around after this season and chased the Championship a couple of times, and then eventually to come up must have felt very nice for them as well. So, yeah, fair play to Brighton for that. But, yeah, this was a bad season. 14-15 is one Brighton fans will certainly want to forget. Burnley 2014-15, 19th in the Premier League now. This was the only season of the decade Burnley did get relegated. They did get relegated back in 2010, but I'm starting to count the season after that. Yeah, and a relegation for Burnley, 19th place. It was a pretty miserable. You never really felt like Burnley were going to stay up in this season. It was always looking like they were going to get relegated. You never felt like they were at Premier League quality. But to be fair to Burnley, they've stuck with Sean Dyche. He brought them back to the Premier League at the first time of asking. So yeah, fair play to Burnley for sticking with their goods, but this 14-15 season wasn't all-round misery. Burnley still got a couple of good Premier League results, but they did get relegated, so you've got to say it certainly wasn't a good season by any means. Chelsea 2015-2016. This is the easiest probably one in the list. Chelsea finished 10th in this season in what was an awful season, going in as Premier League champions, and everyone thought Chelsea would do well. They barely signed anyone in the summer, which was their first problem. And yeah, Chelsea had a disastrous season. 10th place, they were probably lucky to finish there. Till about January time, it was looking like they could even be battling relegation, Chelsea. It was that bad for them. Jose Mourinho was sacked in December. Goose Hiddink came in and rather steadied the ship with a few draws, really, and a couple of good results here and there. But this was a very poor season for Chelsea, though, and easily their worst since in the last decade, comfortably. 10th place, just forgettable all round, to be honest. Crystal Palace 2010-2011, 20th in the Championship. Fair play to Crystal Palace, they've came a long way since this moment, but this season they just about stayed up in the Championship, 20th place. A bad season. 2 years later they were getting promoted, which really shows how much they jumped, and that's the beauty of the Championship, I guess. You can have a season where you stay up and your momentum just builds, and then, you go up the next season, but two seasons. This happened with Crystal Palace. Yeah, it was a bad season, but they've certainly kicked on since here. But this was a season to forget, really, a bad one to start the decade. So, Everton 2015-2016, 11th in the Premier League. Now, Everton had back-to-backs back-to-back 11th place finishes in 2014-15, then 15-16, both under Roberto Martinez. I'd say this one was the worst of the two. Everton did get to the League Cup and the FA Cup semi-final this season, to be fair to them, but I'm basing it on sole league seasons, and this one was a pretty bad one for Everton. Plus they put in probably the worst Merseyside derby performance ever when they got utterly embarrassed 4-0 by Liverpool, and this wasn't even the Liverpool we know today. This was a Liverpool who just started under Klopp and were in major transition. Yeah, this was a majorly forgettable season for Everton, really, and one I'm pretty sure they've tried to forget by now, but it was 11th, it was a poor season, and yeah, Everton have certainly tried to move on from this since. Leicester City, 2010-2011, 10th place in the Championship. Now, we know what Leicester's best season of the decade was, of course, that would be when they won the Premier League in 15-16, but their worst still isn't a disaster necessarily, of course. They had spent a season in League One, but that was before the decade, and even 10th place in the Championship wasn't bad, but when you look at how far they've come since Leicester City, of course, winning the Premier League, now they're in the Champions League places, it certainly doesn't look good, and, you know, they had a pretty standard mid-table finish season here, so I'd probably say this was their worst season of the last decade, and it wasn't even terrible, but in the Championship, 10th place, still not great either. Liverpool, 2014-15, 6th in the Premier League. Now, this was a difficult one to choose. You could easily choose the 2010-11 season when Liverpool had Roy Hodgson, but I do believe Kenny Dalglish salvaged a little bit of that. The main reason I'm going for the 14-15 season is because I think Liverpool finished second the year before as well, very nearly winning the Premier League, came a couple of games away, and they had such a drop-off. They had to cope with a front three in this season of Fabio Borini, Mario Balotelli and Ricky Lambert, and this was Steven Gerrard's final season in a game where they got hammered 6-1 by Stoke City on the final day of the season. They got doubled this season by Manchester United. Yeah, let's just say it was a pretty forgettable season for Liverpool, really. One that Brendan Rodgers did keep his job for the short run, but was sacked soon after. But this was a pretty bad season for Liverpool, and a massive come down from the year before as well, mainly due to the departure of Luis Suarez, that was, and constant injuries to Daniel Sturridge. But yeah, this was a bad season. Manchester City, 2015-2016, 4th in the Premier League. Now, Man City haven't had too many bad seasons. I was debating between this one and the 12-13 season. The 12-13 season was the one when they, just after they won the Premier League, and they only signed Jack Rodwell and Scott Sinclair and finished second, way behind Manchester United. But this season, they only just scraped top four. For a team of Man City standards, that's not really good enough. They only beat Man United on goal difference to the Champions League places. So they were quite lucky, really. This was the season before Pep Guardiola arrived, and it was a pretty forgettable one, to be honest with you. Manuel Pellegrini's last season. City were looking good at the start of this season. They won their opening 5 games, I believe it was, but after that it was a very mixed season, really, and wasn't really a lot to show for it at all. They did win the League Cup, I guess, so that was something, but yeah, this wasn't a great season for Man City. One I'm sure they'd have liked to forget overall. Manchester United, 2013-2014, 7th place in the Premier League. Now, this one may seem obvious, but I was debating between this season and last season, really, the 2018-19 one, because that was a pretty forgettable season for United. I know they went on that good run under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, but that mainly was down to that 3-1 win against PSG, which wasn't actually in the Premier League. But yeah, this 13-14 season under Moyes was pretty... I mean, Man United was so used to having success at this point. This was just a massive come down. 7th place, and it was a pretty miserable season for them, to be honest with you. Doubled by Liverpool, doubled by Manchester City. Never really ever looked like competing for the top 4 or the title. So this was just a massive come down for Manchester United, and the football wasn't great either. I've got to say, they've had a few bad seasons, Man United, since here, but I'd probably say this was the worst overall. Newcastle United, 2015-2016, 18th in the Premier League. Now, this relegated Newcastle, so it's a very obvious choice as Newcastle bounced back at the first time of asking. Yeah, this is a season where Newcastle got relegated with a team they probably shouldn't have got relegated with. They had the likes of Gini Wijnaldum, Moussa Sissoko, who have both gone on to play Champions League finals since here, proving that Steve McClaren was just doing a pretty poor job at the club overall. Massive come down for Newcastle. They did come up at the first time of asking, but this was a team that shouldn't really have got relegated, to be honest with you. But they did, and they just to top it off as well, Sunderland stayed up above them as well, their local rivals, just to make it that little bit worse. But yeah, this was a bad season. Newcastle have since forgotten this season, and if this new takeover does happen that's rumoured, they'll certainly forget seasons like this in the long run. Norwich City, 2017-18, 14th in the Championship. Now Norwich have been known as a bit of a yo-yo club the last decade, but this season was more of a mid-table mediocrity in the Championship, which I probably would say is a worse season than getting relegated from the Premier League. Norwich came up this season after this, of course, as well. So to go from 14th to first, which is very, very possible in the Championship, was this is a season of mid-table mediocrity where they never really looked like going up, but they never really looked like going down. It was a very boring season, I guess, if you're a Norwich fan overall. But yeah, this was enough. I'd probably say this was their worst season due to the fact nothing eventful really happened, which in a Norwich City season is quite rare. Sheffield United, 2015, 2016, 11th in League One. Does that not prove how far this club have come? From 4 years ago, going to being mid-table in League One to being near enough top 5 or so in the Premier League. Quite crazy, to be honest with you. Just shows how much this team Bramall Lane has improved. But yeah, this was a League One season of mid-table mediocrity, and that's in League One. That really does prove how much of a bit of a state the club was in at the time, just 4 years ago. But it does show that clubs can turn it round so much with just a couple of good seasons. But yeah, this was again a mid-table mediocrity season in League One, so I've got to say it's probably their worst season, to be honest with you, in the last decade. Southampton, 2017, 2018, 17th in the Premier League. Now, it's not an easy one to choose, Southampton, this. They got promoted. They've had some good seasons. They got back-to-back promotions in 10, 11, 11, 12, so I can't really choose them. And then they've stayed in the Premier League ever since. 17-18, they survived by near enough the skin of their teeth, winning a crunch game against Swansea, second from last, 1-0. And this was a pretty bad season. Southampton were, I think this was the season you can say selling their best players thoroughly caught up with them as well. They were always pretty comfortable mid-table at this point, but they just survived in this season, so they got there in the end, but I mean, it wasn't a great season for them, I'd say. So I'd definitely say that this is their worst one, and they're closest to being threatened to go back down to the Championship. So yeah, 17-18 is a pretty obvious choice here, I'd say. Tottenham Hotspur, 2013, 2014, 6th in the Premier League. Now, it's difficult to choose a worse Tottenham season. They've only finished 6th, I believe. That would be the lowest, arguably, they've finished in the last decade. So it's difficult, but the 13-14 season, when you look at results-wise, was a pretty bad one for Tottenham. They got hammered twice by Liverpool, hammered twice by Manchester City, doubled by Arsenal, and then they got hammered by Chelsea. Despite finishing 6th, it was a bad season for Tottenham. They got hammered in a lot of big games, really. Andre Villas-Boas was sacked in December, replaced by Tim Sherwood. Yeah, this was just a bad season overall for Tottenham. The season where they sold Gareth Bale and replaced him with a lot of deadwood players, really. Not good enough players, so this was I'd say this was their worst season overall, and just the fact this received so many hammerings as well certainly wouldn't have gone down well with Spurs fans. But since Pochettino's came in, as we know, Spurs are starting to have came a long way. Despite not winning a trophy, it's been massive progress since this season 6 years ago. Watford, 2013-14, 13th in the Championship. Sticking with 13-14 season, Watford, this was a season of, I guess, mid-table mediocrity again, really, and this was 13th. It's just one of them boring seasons. I guess you can say it's their worst because it was a very unconvincing one. So yeah, I'd go with 13-14. This is the lowest Championship finish I believe Watford had in the decade as well. So I'd go with this one for sure. West Ham 2010, 2011, 20th in the Premier League. Easy choice. West Ham were convincingly relegated in the 2010-11 season, having a god-awful season. So this choice is fairly easy to choose, to be honest with you. And yeah, they did come up the first time with asking 11-12. So yeah, I'm just going to go with a very convincing 2010-11 season, 20th place finish. And it was awful. Everyone pretty much guessed they were down from the start of the season with how bad the club was in a state at the time. Wolverhampton Wanderers, 2012, 2013, 23rd in the Championship. Yeah, again, probably one of the easiest on this list. Wolves in 12-13 got relegated to League One, and since then they've been on an upward rise ever since. They've had a couple of seasons of Championship mid-table mediocrity and a couple of close-ish survives, I guess, but it's also been quite comfortable at the same time. But yeah, this season was a dark day for Wolves, just getting relegated from the Premier League the season before. Yeah, this was a dark day. They then finished 23rd in the Championship, were relegated. Yeah, bad day in the history of Wolverhampton Wanderers, but since then they're up, and look how far they've come since this moment as well. And they are now, of course, in the Europa League, if that does continue, but they were in the Europa League, and of course, better times are much be ahead in the coming seasons for Wolves as well, but this was not one to remember. So yeah, that's my list. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and please let me know if you've done anything different, and I'll be back soon with more football content on this channel. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.